First Minister, just a few months ago, Jackie Kay, the Scots Macker, said that Scotland had to grow up about racism. She commented that the history of slavery is not part of Scotland's national curriculum, so there is widespread ignorance across the country of its active role in slavery. Last month, CRER, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, wrote an open letter to our Parliament criticising the lack of focus on race over the past 20 years. They looked at chamber debates and the work of committees and have found that overall race is discussed much less now than it was in the early days of Parliament. For example, over the past 2 decades, there have been only 5 chamber debates on race alone, with an 11-year gap between a debate on race equality led by the Minister for Communities in June 2006 and one held in December 2017 led by the Cabinet Secretary for Communities, Social Security and Equalities. They rightly question why that is. Could it be the joining of the equality strands into the Equalities Act 2010, or the lack of BME representation in our Parliament, or
difference between a black individual in Parliament advocating for the BAME community and that of a white nationalist? I'm not advocating for white nationalism, but I do find it remarkable how that is deemed as the pinnacle of racism in modern day society, but yet by stark contrast there's this constant calls and demands for diversity quotas, etc, and representation. And whenever this representation begins to show itself, it seems that the representatives do nothing other than talk about people that they represent. The response that you tend to hear in relation to raising this issue is that Parliament's majority white, therefore you're already represented. And they know themselves that that's rather disingenuous. They know themselves that that's the claim of being ignorant as a society because we don't get taught about the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. What is this obsession with talking to no end about the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, but yet leaving out every other historical event, including the Arab slave trade? The UK played a role in ending slavery in that era. There seems to be a resurgence of slavery emerging in Libya, where Africans that are being enticed to come to Europe via the Mediterranean Sea never seem to see the Mediterranean Sea, as they seem to end up in the hands of Arabs who then enslave them. No mention of that though.
Is it because the Scottish Government is not undertaking work that can be scrutinised? 2 decades later, BME groups still experience significant inequalities and disparities in all areas of public life in Scotland. From
inequalities in question tend to be disparities, things to the effect of BAME individuals will claim that they felt they were discriminated against when it came to the interview process and trying to get a job. Now, you boil that down, there's no proof whatsoever that they were racially discriminated. The fact of the matter is, if they've bought into this sort of diatribe, they're probably having their beliefs reaffirmed. But for the average Joe, they very well assume that they didn't get a job because they were black, for example. And that's clear-cut proof as far as these activists are concerned, because they don't really have that much to go on. Nobody is disputing whether or not racism exists, and nobody is disputing whether or not there was racist individuals within society. But this constant narrative that once upon a time existed in the far corners of American college campuses seems to have trickled over here, and now on a daily basis we're reminded of just how fucking racist Scotland is as a country.
Employment to housing to education and justice. And nearly a quarter of people living in Scotland believe there is sometimes a good reason to be prejudiced against certain groups. They ask, and I'm asking you, First Minister, isn't this Scotland 20 years on entitled to strong leadership from politicians and an acknowledgement that racism exists in our institutions and structures?
Oh, of course it does. Let's tear them down and start from scratch then, eh?
Minister. But I would never seek to suggest that racism doesn't exist in Scotland in broader society as well as in different institutions. I believe it does, and I believe we all have an obligation, a very serious obligation, to both acknowledge that and to tackle it. There are many different issues that have kind of been thrown up by your question, which I'll try to run through as quickly as possible. The Scottish Government does a great deal of work around equality generally and different aspects of equality. I'd be happy to look at whether we could bring a particular debate to Parliament, although I do think this is more fundamental than that. You talk about BME representation in Parliament, which is something that I think we have got, a mountain of work still to do around, and that's for all of our respective political parties to take seriously, and we've all got work to do on that. There are still a number of barriers to BME communities in terms of access to services, in terms of employment that need to be dealt with systematically.
Nothing from the woman who proclaims that there's also systemic institutional barriers that hold back women. Instead of just accepting that men and women are different. Oh, no. Not thin lips. Men and women are equally as intelligent. Men and women are equally as capable. Therefore, it stands to reason that there must be something systemic holding women back. This is the sort of BS these people truly believe, or at the very least, they make it seem as if they believe it.
And then, I suppose more generally, and it's something that I will not be alone in feeling a discomfort about. So I don't think at any point over the past 20 years could we ever have confidently said we've dealt with the issue of racism in Scotland. I think that complacency would always have been completely misplaced and wrong. And I should say, I think Jackie Kay was right to jolt everybody out of any kind of sense of complacency around this. But nevertheless, I think there is a sense in more recent times that progress that not just Scotland but maybe across the UK and further afield that we had sort of taken for granted we had made, and that things were going in the right direction, that all of us have had cause to question whether that.
And it just so happens that it all seems to coincide with the mass migration that the West has been seeing in recent years, the UK for the best part of 10, as the diversity levels increase. They're met with a resurgence in accusations that society is all of a sudden going backwards when it comes to racism. It was me thinking diversity was a cohesive and great, fantastic strength.
Actually the case, and whether I definitely think there is a sense of renewed licence that some people feel to articulate racist attitudes and to voice racist slurs, and the general sort of, and I'm absolutely not pointing the finger at anybody or any political party, but the general tenor of our political debate, I think, risks taking us back the way here. So I don't think we should ever have been complacent over the past 20 years, but I absolutely think now is a time where we really have to look ourselves very hard in the mirror and decide that this is something we have to collectively give much more priority and leadership to.
No, that was a nod.
First Minister, Clare have also written to my committee and asked us to scrutinise the Scottish Government's Race Equality Action Plan following the publication of a Year 1 progress update.
That woman, I managed to come across what that woman was referring to there, and my God. Black artists are more likely to be overlooked for opportunities, and of course that is institutional racism. Hardly any of our suggestions or constructive criticisms were included in the consultation analysis. There was a cursory mention of inclusion in the key themes report and acknowledgement in the full report of concerns regarding representation. The use of the word diversity, care needed to ensure BAME groups are involved, and a need to increase inclusive work opportunities in the sector. However, other more systemic issues were dismissed. The race-specific issues we raised, which were dismissed in the analysis, included a nationwide survey of diversity in the arts, which found that half of BAME respondents saw their ethnicity as a barrier to career progression, but the fact that they saw their ethnicity as a barrier does not mean that their ethnicity was a barrier. All too often we have people's perceptions being used as clear-cut examples of barriers and institutional racism and so on and so forth, when it's nothing other than somebody's perception. Creative Scotland's regularly funded bodies, no chief executives, artists, directors or chairs, and only less than 2% of board members, permanent staff, freelance staff, etc. had a BAME background. Well, that sounds about right, considering they can't be much more than 5 or 6% of the population. I wouldn't have thought at this point, maybe more, who knows. But the fact of the matter is, out of that 5 or 6%, how many of them want to be involved in Creative Scotland? It doesn't indicate racism unless you are looking for racism. The relationship between culture and its wider historical context. The history of slavery, colonialism and the empire continues to impact black communities. Of course it does. And black artists in Scotland today, of course it does. The relationship between culture and its wider context, the history of slavery, colonialism and empire continues to impact black communities in Scotland today. While the rich and complex history of Scotland is celebrated and studied, and despite black communities having long been intertwined in this story, often this history ignores or poorly represents black groups. Furthermore, there was no mention of calls to develop specific plans to improve representation of groups in the culture sector, equality of opportunity for black artists, and moving away from the deficit-based model of capacity building. Examine of the impact of the broader story of Scotland's history and the continuing impact of white supremacy and white privilege. Commit to educating white leaders about race equality. Define equality. A long-standing reality of institutional racism. Point to it. Informed by the impact of slavery, of course. Fucking slavery and colonialism. Are you going to talk about the Arab slave trade? Of course you're not, because it doesn't suit the narrative. It doesn't suit the narrative because they're standing alongside you in Scotland as ethnic minorities and you're equally as oppressed as each other because the white man bad routine is about the only thing these activists have got going for them. Hope that the final strategy will take cognizance of these issues and strongly urge the government to engage with black groups in the issues. If not, culture in Scotland will continue to be yet another place where racism continues to thrive. What the fuck are they talking about? And not, culture in Scotland will continue to be yet another place where racism continues to thrive. We would be foolish to dismiss anything that these people have to say because they know the inside scoop and modern day white supremacy and white privilege in society.
The oversight within government and the Race Equality Action Plan is, but for the benefit of everybody else here, sets out the actions that we will take during the current parliamentary term. We appointed Caliani Lyle as our independent race equality advisor back in 2017 to provide both advice and challenge to help us advance race equality and tackle racism. So in some respects, the action plan responds directly to the recommendations that she has made. In the 2 years since it was published, I think some progress has been made, but there is still a lot to do. In terms of the oversight within government, there is a programme board that is chaired by the Director General for Education, Communities and Justice, with a strong governance structure in place. The next update report is due, I think, in March 2020, so very soon, which will set out the progress that has been made and what work is underway to take forward actions in the areas where we've still got work to do. And I think the scrutiny that you've talked about today that your committee will apply will be a useful part of that process.